So we are on our second session this Sunday. Sister Denise, before anything, I would like to just share a private message that was sent to me after the first session. And this message went, I'm really grateful to Sister Denise especially for the latest class on spiritual relationships and her distinguishing the BK org and the Yagya. Somehow it gave me the security that I am still with Baba.
Yes, of course. Yeah. Okay, very good. Thank you so much, Sister Rose. Well, I think we might as well just go right into the write-up, second part of it, and I will talk about the points. Maybe some of them need some expansion, definitely they do. And then we can see globally. Of course, what we did last time was to look at the Yagya and organization as a unit. And there's difference between organizational relationships, which is administrative, and spiritual relationships, which I am looking at as there is a network of these souls who all recognized Shiv Baba through Brahma Baba and who began the process of study, meditation, spiritual service, and in the process developed long-lasting relationships. I have been with Brahma Kumaris 50 years, and that's most of my life. And most of my friends, deep spiritual friends, have also been 30, 40, 50 years in the practice. And of course, we span many countries, many cultures. We are beyond all those things through the power of our personal relationship and the long pilgrimage that we have had together. And now we are at a juncture where there are many changes going on, which is why it's really, I think, very valuable to look at our spiritual relationships and what spiritual relationship can mean and how we interpret what's happening now. So let us begin. So this session of EGY is about spiritual relationships. That means we relate to each other as spirits, and it is a heart relationship, a soul relationship, not limited by centers or countries or anything like that, but it's a relationship that is based on resonance in the mind and heart, like-mindedness, and having lived together, worked together, been through stuff together. All these things deepen and broaden a relationship. And this is not a relationship that is a lokic relationship, which means based on family or blood ties. And it's much more than a relationship based on being part of an organization, much deeper than that. So today we will restrict our discussions to the spiritual relationship between those Brahma Kumars and Kumaris who consider themselves Raj Yogis. That means this study is really important for us and the meditation. Our life is based on that. So we know each other in this context of the study and practice of Raj Yoga rather than or much more than in the context of the organization, which is mostly connected with spiritual service, interface with the general public. So we make the assumption that EGY, which means explorations of Gyan and Yoga. This is a word we came up with to apply to this loose gathering of BKs who have known each other since several decades. So explorations of Gyan and Yoga, that's what we do here. So these are mostly people not born in India or of Indian parentage, mostly, but at the same time, there are many of Indian ancestry living in the Western world who are part of the EGY gathering. And there are also many who are not in Gyan since decades, but more recent, and who do not know each other because of recent arrival in this gathering, and yet they feel connected, and they feel, yeah, I know these people, I'm one of these, and want to be closer. So there are important common elements that bind together this online gathering of people. Now, these are quite important to bear in mind. This is why we are doing this. This is why we are together. And so the common binding elements are, we all like to be or become soul conscious. We like that. We want that. We like the murli. This is our food for the mind. We like Shiv Baba, Brahma Baba, and the Dadis. These are the people who we know to be and we experience to be the embodiments of Gyan and Yoga. And these are the people who are at the beginning of this extraordinary journey. Shiv Baba, incorporeal God, Brahma Baba, his medium, and the Dadis are the people who were with Bab Dada, Shiv Baba and Brahma Baba, to set it up. Many people ask, who makes decisions about what happens? And it's really all this three. Shiv Baba gives information, Brahma Baba interprets it, the Dadis discuss with Brahma Baba and Shiv Baba, and in this way, the ways of the Brahman family, what we can call Brahman culture, and how we do things, all of this is decided collectively. It's not Shiv Baba giving orders which we have to obey. It's very much consensus-based. They feel motivated to work together or separately to make the world a better place. And all of us are very aware this world is in a mess, and we are also ready to let it fall apart. But we're learning ways and systems and spiritual technologies and pure karma that cause the world to be a better place. So we're definitely working with Shiv Baba and Brahma Baba. And so the Dadis are mostly all in abhyakt form, even though they've taken rebirth. Brahma Baba is in abhyakt form, having not taken rebirth. And Shiv Baba is there, but he has taken a step back, and we can understand that he has said everything he has to say, and we have received the sustenance of Shiv Baba through Sakar Baba, that means Brahma Baba in physical form, and Avyakt Bab Dada, which means through the subtle form, the angelic form of Brahma, because Brahma Baba is most unusual in that he did not take rebirth, but he is in the subtle body, moving around in the subtle regions, extremely active, very incognito, just about tangible if you stay in the abhyakt form yourself, but intangible for those who are in gross form. So we are all people who consider ourselves to be Raj yogis, even more than Brahma Kumars and Kumaris, Raj yogis. This is what we do. We practice Raj yoga. We are yogis. We are connected with God. And our work is mostly through vibrations. We are people who feel a deep and ancient connection with each other. And we are very aware of the eternally repeating 5,000-year cycle. So we know that our connection with each other is eternal, past, present, and future. So it's very powerful. We consider ourselves part of the yagya, more so than the organization. Most of the people who are in EGY are not very engaged as like functionaries of the organization. We don't necessarily, although some do, we don't necessarily have a title, an organizational title. We're just basically people who study and practice Raj Yoga, who've had a lot of experience, who've done a lot of organizational work, but who are not necessarily focused on that primarily. Our primary function, our focus, is to develop individually and collectively our understanding of Gyan and yoga. And so some, like the person who sent a message to Rose and mentioned that this person mentioned they were very happy that even if they're not very engaged with the organization, they're still very much part of the yagya. And some people are not comfortable with this division that I make between the two, but many people are very relieved that there is such a thing. So that is a reality. So we are people who may become disconnected from the organization, but will always remain part of the yagya. And there may be other common elements. So in this session of EGY, we look at the spiritual relationship between people who feel bound together on the basis of these 7 or 8 elements. So spiritual relationship is about how we treat each other, how we respect each other, care for each other, how we set limits and boundaries, and the fact that setting limits and boundaries is necessary and it is your right and it's healthy. How we deal with taboo subjects. There are always taboo subjects wherever you go. And in the BK world, there are many taboo subjects which you just absolutely don't talk about. So sexuality is one of them. Mental illness is another one. Mental illness, or you can say trauma, which is a wound in the psyche, wound in the soul, wound in the heart, because these have a huge bearing on how you do your spiritual practice and how you interpret in the process of your spiritual practice, how you interpret when these things come up. And if it's not talked about, then you are diminished in your ability to develop spiritually. So dealing with taboo subjects is important. The matter of what I have always called toxic conventional morality, toxic conventional morality is a very important matter. Why it's toxic is because it's based in the system of patriarchy, which is disbalanced and biased, and therefore in many ways contradictory to spiritual practice, but yet it's very present and evident. in the circumstances of people who are connected with the BK organization. Karmic accounts, a lot of people don't get given much education about karma, karmic accounts, and so on. In the early days when we were very few, and we used to have a great deal of discussion about these things with Daddy Janki, who was really an expert on all of this. So all these things were part and parcel of our education, but it's not so much there now. And so many people miss out on this. So it's important for us to take this up. The matter of private life, to what extent is our life private, and to what extent do we allow other people in the name of the organization or in the name of God or whatever to invade our privacy? And so that's connected with setting limits and boundaries, because we are not items of property, but the patriarchal system defines women in particular as items of property. And so there are many who sort of include these things in their interaction with people and cross boundaries, which they think is okay to cross, but it's not necessarily okay. So we need to take up the question of private life as well. And then culture. Culture is a huge matter. I don't know if we'll be able to talk about culture enough or adequately in this session, but at least we can open up the subject. And it's always been an issue in the Brahma Kumaris since the very, very beginning. This is because culture is the ways of a particular group of people, which are always different from the ways of any other group of people. And when you have a culture which is the dominant culture, then they will say that their ways are the right ways and all the other people have to adopt those ways. And if they object, then there will be some form of punishment or something that they will be they will experience a lot of difficulty, hardship, diminishment, maybe disrespect because of their culture. And that's not necessarily a spiritual value by any means. So we need to talk about culture. In the beginning of the Yagya, pretty much all the people were Sindhis. So Sindhi culture is very specific, and within Sindhis, there are different groups. And so the first group were those who were of the same caste and class and even street where Brahma Baba lived. So everybody had the same living arrangements, the same ways of dealing with birth, marriage, and death. The same way of dealing with behaviors of people, attitudes towards family members, the relationship between males and females, business. All of this was very much that culture. And then when you add somebody from another part of India, then it's a different culture. So then there has to be a negotiation between the cultures and arrival at an agreement as to what the culture is. So in the beginning of the BKs, quite early on, when they moved from Sindh, Hyderabad, Sindh to Karachi, there were a few Gujarati people who joined. So Sindhis and Gujaratis, from the Lokik point of view, they really don't like each other because the Gujaratis think the Sindhis are alcohol drinking, meat eating, very multiple marriage people. These are the attitudes of Gujaratis towards Sindhis. And I know this because I have lived with both. And I hear what they think about each other. And so that is a kind of background that has to be overcome. So there was an interesting incident where the Gujaratis said, well, we can't eat food prepared by Sindhis because it's not pure, because they're not vegetarian. And Baba said, look, you're vegetarian, they're vegetarian, you remember Baba, they remember Baba. Baba is giving you directions that you are all Brahmins, this is all one culture, and so you should definitely eat the food prepared by a Brahmin, because you should not think of this as a Sindhi or you're a Gujarati. You should think that this is Brahman, and they're making Brahma Bhojan, and so you eat it. So in this way, Brahma Baba would address the issues as they came up and give the explanation as to why they should get past their prejudices and preconceptions, because everyone has those. And whenever they present themselves, it has to be discussed, and you arrive at an agreement, and from then on you follow what you agreed to. And this is how the Brahmin culture is gradually created. And as time went on and the family expanded after moving to India, other people started to come in. And of course, every community has a different form of Hinduism. And so all the background of all is Hindu, but their form of Hinduism is different. And Hinduism varies gigantically from village to village and region to region. So village to village is a small difference, region to region is a big difference. And then when it becomes international, that is huge, unresolvable difference. But Baba says, no, we can resolve even that. And so it is a gathering of people whose background culturally and religiously and politically is as varied as you can get. There's people from capitalist countries, communist countries, dictatorships, failed states. There's people from all different varieties of Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, all mixed together into one family. But in the process, everything has to be worked out. And Baba always draws people's attention to the fundamental elements that are easy to agree on because they're so fundamental to what human life means. And nowadays, these things are not particularly taken up, and it's sort of easier to create a dominant culture and make everyone go along with that. But when you make shortcuts, it doesn't always satisfy people. So it's quite good to take a look at cultural matters in the way that Baba did in the early days. And I do think that it's possible. So we're also looking at rights and responsibilities in the context of each other. And this is to do with conventional morality. So in some parts of the world, people function, at least ideally, according to the Declaration of Human Rights, which I attached to this document and sent it around to everyone. And so I'm hoping that all of you have read that. And this is a document that was created around the same time as the BKs began. And interestingly, the AA system was also developed. The 12-step system for overcoming addiction was also developed at that time. So it was a very, very potent time for ideas. And all of these ideas of Shiv Baba, of the idea of human rights, and the idea of overcoming addictions, and knowing that addiction is a spiritual problem, not a behavior problem, is very relevant. And it's very useful to look at all these three simultaneously, because they relate to each other very, very closely. And where you have cultures which are exceedingly patriarchal, then those who are at the top of the hierarchy have rights, but those who are further down are progressively denied rights on the grounds that they're not complete humans, or they're not the right kind of humans, or something like this. And so in many cultures of a patriarchal nature, younger people or female people, people in female bodies, are denied rights on the grounds that if you're not a man, then you're not human, so you don't have any right to vote, you don't have any right to express your opinion, you are to be treated as an item of property or an object. And Shiv Baba says, well, you know, you're souls, so where's the object? The object is the body. So you have male bodies and female bodies, which are objects, but an object is not a being, and a being is not an object. So he changes our drishti. Drishti means how you look at things. It means perspective. It means perception. So we have to also look at perception, soul conscious perception, body conscious perception. And people are absolutely conditioned by their perception and how their social conditioning impacts their perception. So this is very important. I find it useful to say that spiritual relationship is distinct from physical relationship in the same way, the exact same way as shrimat is distinct from paramat and manmat. So we do have to talk quite a lot about what paramat is and what manmat is and what shrimat is. Shrimat is very specific, and shrimat does not mean directions, although most people think it does. But why do people think shrimat means directions? Is because shrimat is the first word of the title of the scripture that Shiv Baba refers to, Shrimat Bhagavad Gita. And in that sense, shrimat means the pure mat. The mat does not mean directions. Mat means ideology, and that means concepts. And so the Gita is God speaking to humanity, saying the concepts, this theological and other religious concepts that people have been working with for millennia are incorrect. And he is here to correct them. And so this word mat refers to conceptual ideas about what God is, what you are, what life is, how the reincarnation goes, how karma works, what are the laws of karma, the laws of spirituality. And it doesn't refer to how you handle your problems and what's okay and not okay in this situation and that situation. But what happened during the lifetime of Brahma Baba is it was practically impossible for the people to understand the concepts because they were not intellectually oriented in that way. They were hardly educated in that way. Their education was ABC 1, 2, 3, and not much more than that. They studied scriptures, which were created by human beings and not by God. But of course, everybody says the scriptures come from God. God says, no, it doesn't. You guys wrote it. And some things were quite fine, but many things were not. And there are consequences of your incorrect understanding of spiritual matters, to the point where you're about to destroy the whole human race just because of incorrect ideas. And that is fixed in drama, no problem. But he comes at such a time, which is also mentioned in the Gita, and which is quoted many times in many murlis, that at the time when there is adharma and agyan, then God comes to destroy adharma and to set up dharma. And so then these words are translated, and the translations are also very wildly different from the intended meaning, which is why I use the Hindi word dharma. Dharma does not mean religion, but most people think it does, because the word for Hinduism in the Hindi language is Hindu Dharma, but it still doesn't mean Hindu religion. But they translate it as religion because it's in comparison with the other religions. So in that sense, they say, okay, it's a religion, but actually it's not a religion. What is Hinduism? It is the beliefs and practices of people who live and grew up and have ancestry in India. That is Hinduism. And nobody knows who founded it. It's got tons and tons of scriptures, which are all in contradiction to each other. And most of the scriptures got rewritten in about the 5th century, including the Gita. And because they were rewritten, it's all mixed up. And that makes it even more incomprehensible. So then you have lots of gurus who interpret the scriptures, and they all disagree with each other. And so the whole thing is really quite difficult to figure out. And Sheikh Baba says, well, that's not surprising, but I know because I'm God. And so I will open a school and I will teach you what Hinduism is derived from, because the origin of Hinduism is lost. And it's lost because of the cycle having 2 main destructions. Every so often there's little destructions, we all know that, but if you remember the picture of the cycle, between the end of one cycle and the beginning of the next cycle, there is huge destruction. And between the Silver Age and the Copper Age, there is small destruction. And these destructions are referred to in all the scriptures of all the religions, and they're all interpreted differently. So people think that the basis of all the religions is not the same, but they all say it's God, except Buddhism, which says we don't know about God. So we are going to say there is no God. We don't know about the soul, so we will say there is no soul, but we do know a lot about karma. And so we will talk about that, which is very good. And so you can understand that it's quite complicated. And So Shiv Baba gives shrimat, which is very simple. But the expansion of shrimat is because all these people who couldn't understand how to apply gyan would ask Brahma Baba for assistance and guidance. And that assistance and guidance got to be called shrimat as well, because there was always a problem whether this comes from Shiv Baba or Brahma Baba. And that problem is still there because Shiv Baba is incorporeal and consequently intangible. And you can understand Shiv Baba on the basis of what he says. And if you can hold yourself in a soul-conscious, bodiless state of being, then you can have an experience of Shiv Baba, but that could be that he gives you an experience because he is, by definition, intangible. So we, in this explorations of Gyan and yoga, we do look at the historical context as to why something came to mean something which it doesn't actually mean, so we can understand it. And then we can make a distinction that there is shrimat from Shiv Baba and there is guidance from Brahma Baba, which gets to be called shrimat as well. And it's worth our while to distinguish the two because much of the instructions that Brahma Baba was giving was in context of the patriarchal Hindu society in which he was working. And so it was how to manage in that context. So let us look at very, very simply the shrimat that Shiv Baba gives, which completely renders the falsification of the Gita visible. In many Murlis, Shiv Baba says the Gita was falsified, and he doesn't specify by whom, but it can be understood by research. The falsification of the Gita or changing of the Gita corresponded with the beginning of Vedic India. So the Vedas all came out of the prophet soul called Shankaracharya. And so although people in India think that Shankaracharya is the head of Hinduism, they do not think of Shankaracharya as a prophet soul who arrived just like Abraham and Buddha and Christ to essentially start a new religion. And this was all mixed into Hinduism in such a way that he was telling, and people accepted, that what he is saying is Hinduism, and the other stuff, just forget it. And so he took all the scriptures, and not just he himself, but others in his lineage, gradually brought in the ideas of the Vedas. And so the scriptures are not written by one person, they're written by gatherings of gurus and scholars. And so these scriptures are all called eponymous. In fact, all scriptures are eponymous because they're all made up by lots of different people who are scholars in that particular set of concepts, and it changes over time. But this started right at the beginning of the Iron Age, and it marks what the Iron Age is about, Vedic India. And a lot of BKs talk about the Copper Age as if they know something about the Copper Age, but this is just an assumption because the Shankaracharyas did eliminate practically everything that could be grasped about the Copper Age, except for some iconography, some myths and legends, some stories. And it's very difficult without Shiv Baba's knowledge to separate what was before and what was after the setup of Vedic India. So we do have the key to decrypt it. And so it can be done. And those who are interested, they like to do it. If not, doesn't matter. But shrimat, the importance of shrimat is, first of all, you are a genderless soul. Now, this is brand new information, because although in the Gita it says you are a soul, but people always assume male souls and female souls, or Christian souls, Buddhist souls, high-class souls, low-class souls. No, all that's to do with drama and karma, but your identity, if you are a Raj Yogi, high-quality Raj Yogi, you are a genderless soul who has had up to 42 births in a male and 42 births in a female body, which means that by definition, you cannot say a person is a man or a woman. This is the first basic shrimat. Your dharma, the word dharma, as I said before, doesn't mean religion at all. And dharma means what you are, is your definition. So some people define themselves according to their religion, but that is not an acceptable definition, because it's a definition of the body. And Baba's first mantra is, forget your body, bodily relations, and bodily religion. So that means you can't say that it is and it isn't your religion, because that is contradiction. And in Gyan, there are paradoxes, but not contradictions. So we have to isolate the contradictions and figure out which is right. And we also have to isolate the paradoxes, because both are right. Then you have to handle the fact that things which seem to be contradictory are paradoxical and both right, and therefore you have to deal with it. And that is not easy, but it's possible. So your dharma, what you are, is a pure, peaceful, powerful, blissful being of light. That's what you are. It's not your religion, it's what you are, is your dharma. And you are eternal and immortal. So this is the definition of you. And secondly, you have an indelible, predestined role contained in the soul, which repeats identically for every time cycle of 5,000 years. And people don't really like this idea, but he says it is like that. And so you need further information so that you can come to terms with why you don't like this idea and what's your problem with it, why you have a problem with it. And mostly people have a problem with it because of limited and linear thinking. So when you come to Shiv Baba's school, you learn how to think in a cyclical manner or a spherical manner, which doesn't exist in the world of education of the Iron Age, doesn't exist. So that means he teaches you how to use your mind and intellect differently. And very few BKs discuss this matter. Most do not even know that it is such a thing, but it is. And so if you want to understand Raj Yoga as it can be understood, it's quite relevant to know the difference between linear and spherical thinking and come to terms with your identity, because the shrimat is all to do with your identity and God's identity. So the third one is to do with God. God is Shiva, not Krishna or anybody else, is Shiva. And he has what is called an attributive name. Shiva means the benefactor, the seed, the point. That's the meaning of Shiva. And that's why that's his name, because he's the benefactor, the seed, and the point. Nobody else is. He is incorporeal, doesn't have a body of his own. He is immutable, does not change, does not get better or worse, does not get bigger or smaller, does not become purer or impure. Human beings go through all that. God is not a human soul. And this is very difficult for people to handle because they understand human, because they are human. But God is outside of the range of most people, except those that he talks to and who study with him to the point where they're actually able to grasp how he describes himself, so that you can understand the difference between a human soul and the one and only non-human soul, who is higher than human soul. He is omnipotent. That means there isn't anything more powerful than God, although sometimes he says that Maya is equally powerful as God. And he gives his reasons that God is the main influence on human destiny for the first half of the cycle, and Maya is the main influence on human destiny for the second half of the cycle. So in that sense, they're of equal power. And this is his humility, because he enables you to destroy Maya. And he knows exactly what is Maya. He is omniscient. So omniscient doesn't mean he knows what's going on in your mind, because that's not of any interest. Omniscient means he knows everything about the soul, everything about how the universe works, everything about the laws of karma, everything about predestination, everything about freedom, everything about bondage, all those things which human beings want to know, need to know, but cannot find out about by research or by observation, because these things are outside the material world. And you cannot observe something that is not material. And so therefore, science, which deals only with matter, is not useful in letting us know about these things. And he specifies that he is not omnipresent. So this concept of omnipresence comes along with the Vedas, because they, the Vedantic gurus, did a lot of very deep spiritual practice of a hatha yoga type. So you know that Shiv Baba very often mentions that these are hatha yoga people. It doesn't mean they did asanas and pranayama and stuff like that, but their meditation was on matter. And they meditated on matter to the most subtle degree, and they understood matter, and they thought that subtle form of matter is God, because they couldn't distinguish between subtle matter and God. So they said subtle matter is God, and there is no individual God, but subtle matter is everywhere, and that's God. So this is where the omnipresent idea came from. And then people just went along with it, and they combined that with the anthropomorphization of God, which is that you consider God in a human form. So they say Krishna is God, Ram is God, this one is God, and that one is God, and every woman's husband is God, and so on. So they were very gross and misplaced in their interpretation, but it went into the culture and the religion, and it became as if a fact, but it was blind belief in something that doesn't make any sense and does not correspond to any definition of God or the soul. And so Shiv Baba comes along and corrects all that and says, hey, how can you accept something that doesn't make any sense? Let me give you the information that's missing, the information that you need, so that you can then make sense of it all. And then you're able to make wise decisions as you lead your life. So the other part of shrimat is he explains the philosophy of karma, and the identical repetition of the time cycle of 5,000 years. That's a huge piece of study, huge. And of course, in this EGY, we're just specifying these are the areas that are covered by shrimat. And he also explains the physical, subtle, and incorporeal dimensions, or the three worlds. He says all that is shrimat. And how you should brush your teeth and do your hair, that is not shrimat. That is the recommendation of the Brahman seniors, including Brahma, Baba, Mama, Daddies, and whoever, to create this like a boarding school of people who behave well. So, as I said, shrimat has no connection with behavior modification. You need to be very aware about that. Behavior modification is very nice, but this is normal when you have children. And of course, the yajna started with Brahma Baba being around 60 years old, a little bit less than that. Mama being 17 years old. And most of the people were children. There were a few elderly women. And there were some who were married, because in those days there were child marriages. And I believe Brahma Baba's wife was 9 at the time when they were officially married. And in the Sindhi community, you have a marriage very early for the woman. And then the young boy goes off and does business for a few years. And by the time she is ready for her reproductive role, he comes back and they start a family. And the wife is mostly under the mother-in-law. And so the mother-in-law dictates to the wife what should happen and how it should happen and so on. So the girl is very much owned by the family into which she gets married. And this is normal in that community, but once you export it over to the West, it's illegal and unacceptable. And so it's important to bear in mind cultural differences in order to function in a relevant way. So these 5 vices, vegetarian diet, etc., they are called niyam. And niyam are, there is something called yam and niyam. And these are like restrictions and practices. Because you see, a religion is all about how to be better. And it's all about different systems that other people have devised, which somehow make you better. And so vegetarian diet is that, okay, if you say that you are aiming to be a deity through the practice of Raj Yoga, because that's what Raj Yoga is about, and deities are called non-violent. And so non-violent means that you do not cause the death of any creature to sustain you in your stomach. And so you should be vegetarian. Then people say, okay, how about eggs, onions, garlic, wine, beer, whiskey, cigarettes, heroin, cocaine, and whatever else, datura. Shankar likes datura, but God says you don't need that. So these are all religious practices that are included in the BK practice because that society recognized that it is good to do that, but you don't have to. And so in BK, you come to Shiv Baba, he teaches you all these things, and then he says you must practice yoga and you must be pure. And so these are all physical ways of becoming pure. Then Baba added, after a little while, celibacy. And of course, celibacy is known as important, and people who are religious in Islam, Christianity, Judaism, and Hinduism, whenever they do special religious rituals, or you have Ramadan or pilgrimage to Mecca or Lent or any of these special times, then you do celibacy for a month or 2 months or something like that. But nobody had the idea that everybody should be celibate totally. That was totally unacceptable in the community. And this is what created the big drama, because Brahma Baba and Mama were very loving, very affectionate, because people need love. But he made a very clear distinction between sex and love. He said, love, you need love to sustain your soul. You need love and affection. But if you have sex, then there are certain dangers which are contradictory to personal autonomy, freedom. Also, your sexual activity will erode your accumulation of spiritual energy, so that's counterproductive. You will come under the influence of your sexual partner. You will be back in the patriarchal system where there is dominant and dominated individuals. You will not be able to establish equality in the relationship. But if you live together celibate, then you can actually do these things. So this was strongly recommended, because if you're going to do Raj Yoga, then do it in such a way that it works, and don't do things that are counterproductive, because it'll slow down your progress and maybe even prevent you from achieving the goal, which is a very, very high goal. It's not for the general public. How many people want to do this level of spiritual practice? So these are these things. So these recommendations are extremely effective and helpful when doing a spiritual practice and living together in spiritual relationship with each other and with nature in the context of the iron-aged social and political world. So in spiritual relationships, you are accountable to God. You're not accountable to anybody else. Bear that in mind. When you live in the context of Madhuban, or you live in the context of a center, then you have a setup which is modeled on the traditional Indian family system, which is hierarchical. And if you want to live in the Indian traditional family system, then you have to bear in mind that you are accountable to some extent to the people at the top of the hierarchy in order for the group to function. And if there isn't that accountability, it won't function. But accountability goes both ways. And so if you are accountable to seniors, seniors are also accountable to you in a slightly different way, but accountable. And so if somebody doesn't accept their part of the accountability, then you have a problem. So it is important to function with regard to the laws of the land where you live and work. So you are accountable to your government for obeying the laws and paying your taxes and all this sort of thing. But I also say you are recommended to follow the voice of conscience. So if you are a person who understands Gyan and you are adult, then you have the rights of a person who is adult, and all your relationships are based on negotiation, not on obligation where there's no negotiation. And your conscience is properly developed, so you follow the voice of conscience, you're likely to be successful. Bear in mind that no human being can be owned by another human being. Therefore, no one can claim to have rights over you. And this is where you get cultural issues, because in the strongly patriarchal cultures and in the traditional Indian family system, which is based on the patriarchal system, which is all set out in detail in the Manusmriti, this is why you get this situation, which is actually in conflict with the principles of spirituality. And so it has to be sorted out. I'm thinking that we're past 11 o'clock, my time, past 5 o'clock, Philippines time. So I think we'll need to stop here. We covered quite a lot in these few frames, but I think I like to turn it over to Sister Rose and Sister Vanji. And my apologies for talking very quickly to the translators. Thank you so much for keeping up with me. Yeah, Sister Rose, Om Shanti.
Om Shanti, Sister Denise. So, can we have a moment of silence?
So let yourself go into the essence of shrimat. You are a pure, peaceful, powerful, wise, and blissful being of light in essence. You are genderless. You come into a body in a social context, and you have a role to play. And behind that, you are developing yourself as a Raj Yogi. Therefore, Shiv Baba is very important for you. Shiv Baba is incorporeal, supreme God, Father of all souls, the omniscient one, who's here to teach you everything, to be your friend and support, guide. You are on this inner journey in a social context that is in many ways hostile and opposed to your inner journey. All this has to be negotiated. Om Shanti.
Om Shanti. Om Shanti. Sister Denise, yes, you have covered a lot. When cultural differences exist, as it does, what is the better way to go about it rather than doing the shortcut wherein the majority somehow imposes its culture on the rest? I mean, for a more harmonious, um, existence together.
Yes, I think a good principle is this expression, unity and diversity, where unity doesn't mean uniformity, but harmony. So it's very much about negotiating, because what's important to you is different from what's important to another person. And that's even with people who are from exactly the same culture. There are always going to be differences. And if somebody is not, if somebody doesn't function the way you do, and you're the dominant person in the social hierarchy, that doesn't give you the right to impose your ways on the other person. But people think it does give them the right. So that has to be challenged and questioned. Everything needs to be negotiated. And this is why Baba says you are all brother souls. So nobody has any right to impose their way on the basis of they're older, or they're in Gyan longer, or they're in a higher position in the organization, or any other reason. Nobody has that right. When it's a matter of parents and children, it's different, because parents have a responsibility to provide structure to the child. But generally speaking, we do not introduce people to Gyan under the age of 18, which is the age of majority, which means that anything that you think you have a right to do to a child, you do not have the right to do to an adult. This thing. So everything has to be negotiated. So when you're teaching somebody about Raj Yoga, you cannot say you have to do this and you can't do that. That's not really suitable at all. You can say, these are the recommendations, and you are recommended to follow them because it will help you in your practice. And whether you do or not is up to you. Now, we do have certain things like, if you want to go to Madhaban, you need to be celibate, vegetarian, etc. for 6 months. This is because you're bringing people that you want to be sure that they are seriously doing the spiritual practice of Raj Yoga, which means they will be doing this other things as well. And you also want to bring somebody, Madhaban is an intensely high intensity vibration. And you bring somebody who's not following these things into that vibration, they will explode, because it's going to intensify your sensitivity to your conscience. It's going to, if you say you're doing something and you're doing something else, Madhaban is called the Palace of Mirrors. Everybody will know that you're not real. And nobody will say anything, but they'll know, and there'll be a disturbance in the vibration. Now, up until now, all sorts of permissions have been given, but when you are, say, for example, I have lived in Madhaban for many years, and when you are away from the season time, where there's all sorts of people of different degrees and levels of Raj Yoga who come, but when it's only the Madhaban Nivasis, then that high intensity vibration gets really high. And the Madhaban Nivasis do a lot of meditation to make sure it gets really high. Because when people come, they want to come into that high vibration because it feels good. You stay in there for any length of time, it'll start doing its work of purging the toxins within you, not physical toxins, spiritual toxins. And unless you're practicing these ways of physical purity, you may well not be able to handle it. So you see, you have to understand the whys and wherefores of everything so that you can do it because you agree to it, not because somebody imposed it on you.
In the last session, you also talk about, or rather, I ask you about the aspect of accountability in spiritual relationship. And today you mentioned that as well. And as you said, somehow in a spiritual relationship, it's like a mutual thing, like I'm accountable to you, you're accountable to me. Is that right? And if, for example, the other one does not accept his or her accountability, how should I proceed in this relationship?
Well, there, I think it's a matter of an individual process. You have to see, for example, if you are financially dependent on the other, that's a limitation that you have to take into consideration, because if you step away, then how will you eat? And sometimes this fact is used by someone who doesn't want to feel accountable to limit that person. And there you have something that gradually turns into a dysfunctional family circumstance or a tyrannical relationship, which is counterproductive for spiritual practice. And so this is why it's something you need to be very aware about. And I think it's also very much a matter of retaining the sense of personal responsibility and autonomy and independence. And so you have to make your position very clear. The problem arises when someone comes into a center which is set up as a traditional Indian family in a young age, and they will be inducted into it in exactly the same way as a daughter-in-law is inducted. And the people who are used to that, they have their ways of handling that situation, which involves a lot of manipulation and a different type of negotiation than what you would do if you're not from that background, because you just don't have the tools. It's not part of your upbringing. And so you're in a very vulnerable situation. And in India, when the young girl is taken into the in-laws' family, some of them are well prepared, some of them are not at all well prepared. And some of the families are functional because everybody in positions of authority holds themselves accountable by their own volition, because that's their character. But not everybody is a perfect character. You get a few people who are very good character, but nowadays the majority are not. And because, at a time when people are basically of good character and they don't abuse power, it's not an issue. And culturally, it was assumed that people won't abuse their power. But then after some time, it was found that cannot be relied upon. And so therefore you have to do something different. For example, in England, where I grew up, many, many, many years ago, it was thought that anyone who's a doctor or a lawyer is definitely automatically an upright citizen, until you started to find a lot of lawyers and doctors were serious criminals. And then people lost faith. In the same way, religious authorities were considered to be automatically and necessarily morally upstanding until it was found that, well, no, that's not the case. So they used to want you to get your passport signed by a priest, a lawyer, or a doctor, because they would vouch for your character. But then that got set aside because it was no longer the case. So we're dealing with a world which is getting worse and worse quality of character, you can say. And so there you are in a situation where the the sociologists and philosophers and lawyers, and they worked out various ways so that you can make sure that you have your rights. But then there are a lot of people who don't know what their rights are, which is why I added the Declaration of Human Rights, which is not a factual situation in all places, but this is considered in the what we call Western civilization to be the right way of understanding your rights and responsibilities, and especially your rights, because people's rights get violated, especially when they don't know what their rights are or they don't have recourse. And so in BK, it is appropriate to talk about that. And when we did this global functioning work in many years ago, it did start to talk about accountability from the top down and from the bottom up, as it were. But this was considered very I mean, the people in positions of authority in India were not used to the idea that they could be held accountable, and they didn't want that. They thought that that's not a good idea at all. A lot of people thought it was a good idea. I think it's a good idea, but it didn't go ahead. But I still think it's a good idea. And I think it's also one of the reasons why it's quite useful to think about distinguishing between yajna and organization. Because in organization, you have a setup pretty much like a corporation. So all the corporate rules that apply in corporations are suitable in that situation. And all of the organizational things are established on by charters and documents that set out these rules of the people who are in position of authority and the people who are working there, and their rights and restrictions and whatever are set out. And if you're going to come into that function, then you know what your rights are and you know what your limitations are, and there are consequences if they are violated. In the yajna, it's not like that. And so in the yajna, it's really your relationship with Shiv Baba, and you have a lot of other BKs around you, and you need to establish your own limits and boundaries as best as you can. And this is why this kind of study can be helpful to let you know where you stand and what you can do if you find yourself in a situation which feels really uncomfortable for you and that you don't know what to do about it. So this is important.
Thank you, Sister Denise. Vanji?
When we were young in Gyan, the idea of a Brahmin culture was emphasized. And in your discourse today, Sister Denise, you mentioned and you emphasized multiculturalism as a composition of the BK. Even in India alone, there's such diversity. And when you bring in the international BKs in different parts of the world, the multiculturality and diversity is so much. Will I understand therefore that it's the spiritual relationship defined by shrimat that makes the uniformity and standardization of our life? I use the word standardization. It's like there are standards by which we relate with each other, and our relationships are defined by what you mentioned. We're souls, we're not male, female, etc. Is that how we will now operate? And is that what's really covered by a Brahmin culture?
Well, this is a very important question, because the word standardization is very specific to the organization and the policies that the organization talks about, because they wanted to have anyone who comes from any place to any other place and visits a center to experience the same overall feeling and the same quality in the material that is studied and so on. And so what they did is they did something which people do in corporations. Like if you're in Coca-Cola, you want to make sure that Coca-Cola is exactly the same all over the world. So there's a secret recipe, and only certain people are allowed to know it, so it can't be copied. But all Coca-Cola must taste the same, look the same, have more or less the same price, and so on. And you can do that with Coca-Cola. If you take something else, like you're selling real estate, you're selling buildings, and usually, I mean, some real estate you can rent, you can buy, and you have all sorts of trainings that the people do for selling and buying, and then there are solicitors, and there are different rules in different countries, and so you have to have a lot of experts in law so that your process of buying and selling and renting property is, that people get value for money and they don't get ripped off, and they don't get, they're protected by certain things. And if you try and take something like that and apply it to spiritual practice and a person's relationship with God, that's not going to work, because it's not a physical commodity, and you are not either a physical piece of property. So the combination of the corporate idea of standardized Gyan teaching, standardized way of doing service, standardized, all these standardized logos and everything like a corporate image and so on. And then you mix that with the iron-aged traditional Indian family system, you get something which is very restrictive and which doesn't allow for growth and development of the individual. And because of that, which they may not have thought about, because they were thinking so much about the public face, how you bring this to the public and get people to come and take Gyan and learn Raj Yoga and all of that, which is what the organization is for. But in the process, the care of the people who are advanced practitioners and students of Raj Yoga did not get really thought about in a meaningful way, other than as, well, these people can deliver the teachings and they can organize the students and be part of the organizational hierarchy, and that'll be fine. But a lot of people are saying, well, no, it's not fine, because my priority is my yoga and my dharana and my study. And if I'm only for service and I'm getting exhausted by it and I'm not getting any spiritual sustenance of the quality that I need and want and have a right to, then I will say there's a little bit of dissatisfaction. And this is why it's worthwhile to talk about it, to work out a way to fill this gap, which is done as a result of the organization looking only at public face.
So what's the way forward? Because I feel like as a older someone in the an older person in the practice of Raj Yoga, we first, of course, care for ourselves and our growth and development in the practice. But at the same time, there are younger BKs who come in and they ask us. And then they're also exposed to these contradictions of what the Murli tells us and what we see in terms of when people are on the stage and they're off the stage, they seem to be completely two individuals. And we don't see the consistency in behavior and attitude. How does one deal with this so that the disillusionment doesn't happen? Although I remember that in some classes, you would say the disillusionment is actually useful for you because then you become real.
Well, yeah, if you can survive it, because disillusionment is an extremely negative experience. And if you're spiritually strong and experienced, and you've been around for a while, then you can process the disillusionment and move forward as a result of it. But that's few and far between. You can't expect everyone to have equal competence. You see, Brahma Baba always said everybody is number wise. And in the organization, you have regional coordinators, area coordinators, center coordinators, project coordinators, which is not according to the same number wiseness. And there are a lot of people who are in the organizational functions who are not particularly bothered about the spiritual part. It's just the way it is. They are very happy doing the service part. Because you see, everyone's interpretation of what this is their own. And standardization of a spiritual practice is not something you can really get away with, because people are not robots. They're not sheep, they're not cattle, they're not all the same by any means. And if you think that you can make your life easier by thinking of everybody in terms of categories, and you forget that they're individual beings and that you may not be able to tell whether somebody has great spiritual potential or not, you know. So in a lot of ways, the organization and the yajna are at odds with each other. And in India, there is a very extraordinary phenomenon, which is that the political part of India and the spiritual part of India can be absolutely in opposition to each other, but they can coexist. And that's a phenomenon that happens in India because it's such an ancient culture. See, in the rest of the world, all the ancient cultures were wiped out and displaced by the organizational cultures, whereas in India, you know, when modern day India was set up in 1948, it's very recent. And so the old India is alive and well, and you can't get rid of it by any means because it's so strong. And then the administrative, the system of law and government and so on is sort of a veneer on top of that. But that's not the case in other places, you see. And so you can more or less manage it in India. You can get away with it in India because it's been like that for so long. And because India is a place that was under 700 years of Islamic dominance and then 200 years or 400 years of European influence and dominance, and Hinduism as a phenomenon held out against that by tooth and nail. And so you have this system that's in there that we cannot be unhindufied, you know, cannot be. Look what happens to the indigenous people in other parts of the world. They're severely disempowered and psychologically, socially violated by the dominant culture. And they could not, except to some extent, hold on to their original identity. And then you take Gyan with this very strong Hindu substructure and you bring it to somewhere else, it's not going to fit in there just like that. So what happens is the Indian diaspora is all part of India in many ways, so they can manage it, but they're also very aware about other aspects of the Western culture, which is more logical to them and that they function in. So that creates some sensitivity to the parts of the Indian world that is dysfunctional and they don't like it. And so it's in many ways, I think, a very good time for Shiv Baba to step back and say, okay, I've told you everything, you've got all the knowledge now, what you need to do is really work with it. And you're in charge of your life, you are the masters, so you've got all the material you have, now do it. And so my solution to all of this is to say, okay, let's talk about it. And let's take up different aspects of it and see what we can say about it and see how we can find a pathway through, because we have to navigate our way through all these energies which don't necessarily all go in the same direction. And it seems to me that EGY is useful because we're really talking about, okay, what is the knowledge? And what is the organization? And what is yoga? And what are we? And how do we want to do this? And we're not doing it in the context of like we have a product that we want to sell to the public, like an organization. No, this is just us talking to each other about, okay, what is this? And how can we work together in a spiritual relationship and move forward together on this pilgrimage and really advance ourselves in yoga and Gyan and Dharana. And, you know, Daddy Janki always used to tell us that, you know, a lot of people, they put service 95%, and Gyan Yoga 5%. But she liked it better if it would be the other way around, 95% Gyan Yoga, because she said, if your Gyan and Yoga is stable, strong, clean, pure, that will do service. And I think that that is true, because you see, people are pretty knowledgeable and they know what's real and what's not real. And there are thousands of spiritual organizations all trying to do recruiting. And they really need to see that Brahma Kumaris is more of a phenomenon than an organization, and that it is a gathering of people who have access to something that they would also like access to, because it makes your life better. Not in terms of, I promise to make your life better if you do this, that, and the other, not that, no. But you have to really study this and individually see to what extent you want to study it. And there may be projects, people like doing projects, but no obligation, you know. And Baba used to talk about quality rather than quantity. When you want to standardize everything, you're also talking about quantity. Mm-hmm. If you're talking about quality, there's nothing like standard. You know, a human being is a creation of God, collaborating with that human being in that creation. And that's very unique. There's nothing standard about it. So that's really, I think, you know, my solution is, let us take up these points and see how we feel about it, and see how we can make ourselves really comfortable and strong in the practice, where there are just, you know, there's over 1 million BKs, are all different. And of course, many are in big groups and all doing the same thing, but they're still different. And do I want to be in a big group doing everything the same as everybody else? Or do I want to move forward as an individual in my spiritual life my way? I think I have a right to that. Everyone has to choose their way.
We'll take some of the questions here. Having put the distinction between shrimat and guidance or recommendation, to what extent should we be obedient to the guidance of Baba, of Brahma Baba, and the daddies then?
Well, you know, I think that we should remove the word obedience from the Brahman dictionary, because in English, as it's spoken in England and America, where I lived, obedience is something that belongs to the 19th century, where parenting was authoritarian, violent, and imposing. And nowadays, the word obedience is used for training dogs to follow their masters, because dogs are owned by their masters. So when you use the word obedience for a human being, you're assuming that that human being is effectively a piece of property to be owned by someone and ordered around. And that is not God's way. It's definitely not acceptable in the current world. And so if you keep using the word obedience, then you are seriously out of date. There are many words in the English language. You know, even you have the word compliant, you see. So compliance is something that's used by the police and the tax authorities. And it's all about bossing people around. And in BK, they talk about not being bossy, but you can't not be bossy and use the word obedience, because that goes with the territory. So I like the word recommendation. If you want to do this in the optimum way, here are some recommendations, and then it's up to you. You are free. This is voluntary. You are, nobody has any authority over you. You're adults.
But Sister Denise, even in the Murli today, Baba talked about obedience.
Well, in the English translation, he talked about obedience. But this is my point. When you take the words that he was giving, which was given in the 1960s, and even if you say, okay, Avyat Bap Dada, but Avyat Bap Dada is still in that time frame in terms of language. And of course, Baba knows about emails and doesn't know about artificial intelligence, but whatever is told to Dadi Gulzar, that's what you will hear. And these are people who were isolated from the world from the 1920s and remained that way, because anyone who is fully dedicated BK Dadi from 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 years, they are isolated and have no experience of what we call the real world. And so they use language that they're used to from their childhood. And that doesn't have to be used now by people who are not of that age. And so when you turn something from one language into another language, my feeling is it needs to be current, it needs to be relevant, it needs to convey the meaning as it is experienced in the 2023 and not 1923. So 100 years is a big difference. And so obedience is one of these words that needs to be, I think, put in different terminology, you see, because at the moment the terminology is very authoritarian, very much corresponding to the way people thought was good parenting in the 1920s, which nowadays is considered violence and regimental and militaristic and all of that. And the sociologists and psychologists have said, hey, you know, this type of parenting is pretty toxic, so you need to really rethink this. So they did rethink it. But the BKs got kind of looked in a time capsule of the 1920s and 30s, which is very different from how we are today. So if you bring it up to date, people would be really worried about it because they'll say, well, that's not the Murli anymore, you know. And so I think you have to do it for yourself. And if you do it for yourself, then you're not treading on anybody's toes and you know what it means. You've been around long enough to know that you're an adult, that it's up to you what you do. Nobody has any authority over you. And then whatever other language limitations, you can get past it individually. But then when you've got new students and you expose them to that, they're going to walk out the door immediately. So the question is, do you want new students or don't you?
Can I ask a question in relation to this? The Murli of Sunday last week, Baba talked about becoming a child and a master, or a master when ideas are being gathered, and then become a child when a decision has been made, but in a context where that democratic consultation is not really democratic, how does the master and child operate in a spiritual relationship?
Well, it was in the context of Brahma Baba being quite elderly and the BKs being quite young, and Brahma Baba was trying to get people to do things which made sense. And so somebody might have a bright idea, but it's not the right time. And so Brahma Baba would then say, or even the dadis would say, okay, a great idea, but not the right time. But they were used to saying just no without an explanation. And so what happens is when a BK is told, no, we don't like your idea, then they feel it's a put down, which it is.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, it's a matter of how you present yourself. So in these days, you can't apply this concept of master and child because this is 2023, and that was, 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, and people were in a culture where compliance, obedience, and so on was absolutely normal. And, one of the phenomena of India is that there is practically no innovation in that culture, practically none. And anytime you want to invent something, you tend to go back to the ancient original thing and invent the same thing and call it new, but it's the same old thing, like plows and irrigation systems and so on. Innovation happens over in the Western world where people are actually, it's much easier for people to get their new ideas through. It's competitive, but it's not totally squashed from your birth until your death. And so if you have a proposal in BK and it doesn't correspond with the tradition, it's highly unlikely that your proposal will get heard. Even if you wait 50 years, it'll still not get heard because the power of tradition is very strong, maybe disproportionately strong. And this happens in religious environments because religions are always about, you've got to not change anything. You've got to have everything as it was at the time when it started. And that's, if you think of this as a religion, then you will, and if you are a traditional type and you are coming out of that traditional world, that's how you'll be. And if you're in charge of the whole thing, then that will be the culture. And if at some point you die, or a lot of people like that die, and different people come through, you have to see, okay, what kind of differences are they bringing? Are they autocratic, or are they more democratic? Are they more interested in new ideas? I mean, Baba used to say, could you please do something new? Everybody put their hand up. Yes, yes, you will do something new. You offer something new. No, 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 we can't do that because it's new. You've heard it so many times. And so then you get into a little situation of a hamster in a hamster wheel. You just go round and round going nowhere. And so if you want to introduce something new, I think what generally happens in the BK world is different people will do experiments of different new ways of doing things or preferred ways of doing things. So you do get a lot of diversity among people who are not under the dominance of traditional people, and then they will be considered as deviant. Deviant, yeah, because they're not following the tradition, so that makes them deviant. whether it's better or not is not a question. It's whether it's traditional or not that's the question. If you look at the process of any Indian spiritual organization from the 1900s onwards, they all follow the same track because that's how it's done. And when you have a large number of people in BK who all go into the organization and they all bring in the same ideas, you see, and so it will go like that. That's absolutely to be expected. So I think, whether or not you're considered deviant, you have to really consult your conscience. What am I deviating from if I'm deviant? But I'm not deviating from being soul conscious. I'm not deviating from remembering Shiv Baba. I'm not deviating from practicing different kinds of purity. I'm not deviating from studying the Murli. I'm just deviating from iron-aged conventions, which I wasn't involved in the first place. And if you look at it like that, then you say, okay, if I'm deviant, it's all right, doesn't matter.
Sister Denise, thank you so much. There's a comment here that I would like to read. Om Shanti. I loved what Denise said. I have been in great demand by the service. Then when I needed support, I couldn't find anyone. It's amazing in such a spiritual institution. Thank you, Denise, for everything. I guess this kind of feelings is common in many. To have such clarity really helps a lot. Since most centers are run like an extended Indian family, which is hierarchical, I have heard it said by center niwasis when there is a very important decision concerning a particular center that ultimately it is the higher seniors' decision that we should anyway follow. Never mind if the family has reached a consensus or not, have been consulted or not. We are simply expected to accept. What would you recommend so there is more of consultation and respect for consensus the way the daddies were like?
When the gathering is small, there's always a lot of discussion. And I lived with Dadi Prakashmani for 7 years, so I observed closely how she handled Madhuban and all the departments and all the decisions, which was very consultative, and I liked that a lot. And, she was open to that. But I think if you're in a situation where people may not be open to that, you still have your own self-respect to say, okay, I respect the decision that you've made. However, I think we need to reconsider this. I think we need to bear in mind such and such a point, whatever, and continue to give your points because, squeaky wheel gets the oil, as you know. But if you just say, okay, my point is not accepted, therefore I have to be quiet and accept, that's not necessary. You can come back and say, okay, I understand this decision, but I need a further discussion. You see, because if you do not agree with the decision, you will not apply it. That's just the way the human being is. So if there is good leadership, I think that part of it is to really talk to your people who are going to be doing what the decisions are until you get them to agree to it. Or if they really don't agree, then why don't they agree and what adjustments are needed? That's what Dadi Prakashmani did. She was a really very good leader. And there's no reason to deviate from that system or that style, as far as I'm concerned.
Another thing here, the only thing I don't really get is when the BK teacher says not to think about problems, situations, and not to talk about it. The reasoning is that when you do this, you move away from Baba. I understand about not talking about someone, but not to talk to each other about what is going on seems not helpful and not spiritual.
I think that there is something that we used a few times, and that was the dialogue process. And in general, when you have a center, a good quantity of people in a center is 30 to 40. And that just my experience was that, center worked well up to that number. And then afterwards, it tended to divide like an amoeba, which is natural. And so if you have an issue that is pressing, I think it's a useful way to gather together and have a dialogue about it. You need to know how to conduct a dialogue. These are good skills for a coordinator to have. You can't just say, okay, this is higher authority says it has to be like this, therefore we don't discuss it and we don't talk about it. You have to look at this context of this recommendation, don't talk about it, where you have some cultures which are extremely gossipy, not all, but some. And Asian cultures are especially into gossip. And so people will gossip and gossip and gossip for hours and days and weeks and months and years and never really get anywhere, but it takes us a lot of time. And there's a lot of energy, you can say, energy of waste thoughts rushing around. And this is not a good thing. So when they say don't talk about it, they're talking about that, but they don't clarify what they're talking about. Don't talk about it means don't do that endless criticizing in little groups and setting everybody against each other. And this is not necessary. In Philippines, you call it crab mentality, right? So this is that. If you have an issue in a center, which is a real issue, then you say, okay, you start saying, okay, we need to discuss this, all of us together in a proper systematic way. And the dialogue system is quite a good way. And then if you do that, there is no possibility for this gossipy type of thing because it's against the rules of dialogue. You remember, I think you probably did, we had this thing called no gas, no generalizations, no accusations, no speculation, and no speeches. And if you apply those rules and you say we will stick to the subject and everybody has a certain amount of time in which to talk and all of these things, it's a very effective system for arriving at consensus, which means agreement. And so you arrive at agreement about this problem. Is there a solution that needs to be applied? If yes, then you do it. And if something else, then you do that. But, getting consensus is discipline, a discipline of communication. It's a very good one. And it's worth getting skilled in that.
Sister Denise, I think another skill that is good to learn is to know how to negotiate. I think this is something that you have been mentioning, and it really needs a different mindset, in a sense, or consciousness as to what have been used to in terms of even thinking about who we are and our relationship with each other.
So this is very excellent, learning how to negotiate. Actually, when you're in your self-honor and self-respect, you are often in situations where you have to negotiate. And if you set aside your self-honor and self-respect, where you need to negotiate, you won't do it. You'll never develop the skills, because many of these skills are developed in the in the field, you know, in the situation. So when you're under a system that says you have to shut up and sit down, that's Victorian England, you know. That's not Shiv Baba, but you know, that's toxic conventional morality. And where there is this fluidity of everyone being in their self-honor and self-regard, and the people expecting to be held accountable, that's a very, very good thing. And I had tried to lay all these principles out in the value education program that I did way back in 2000. That's what, 20 years ago. But people didn't do it. They stuck with the traditions. So, I mean, it's there, but you know, you have to choose to apply it. And there are many things that are really good that have been developed in, you know, in the corporate setting and the social setting and all this. There's so much development is there. And if there is a lot of meaningful discussion in the BK gatherings, you can bring these things in, but people tend to not do that. That's the way it is. But you do get out of date, and when you go out of date, and then people move on and you get left behind.
Thank you, Sister Denise, once again. Very helpful indeed for many of us. And we look forward to the next session.